The night I closed down Del Dios Highway in both directions was the night of my first date with Paul. At 1:30 in the morning, I left his house. "Drive safe," he said, with a dorky sincerity in his eyes. "Don't be so ominous," I said, ominously. I lived with my parents in Escondido. It wasn't a long drive to UCSD, and it was nice to cut through Del Mar and around Lake Hodges on Del Dios Highway instead of the freeways. I loved that drive. I felt like a professional driver on a closed course. The thing is, I was a professional driver. That year, I had scored the best job on campus, a UCSD shuttle driver. They trained us all summer, and I was suddenly a teenage Class B licensed bus driver and could parallel park a 40-foot bus with an almost mechanical precision. It didn't change the fact that I could barely parallel park a compact car. Despite being a terrible driver, I somehow was trusted with moving hundreds of passengers a day. I drove my own car home late often, and I drove tired often. Late and tired being college defaults. I knew the signs, the drowsy eyelids, the nodding head. I knew the quick fixes. Water, windows down, radio up. It was still before prevalent personal cell phones, so it's not like I could call someone to stay awake. Who would I have called anyway at 1:30 in the morning after a first date? It wasn't quite at that mountainous part of Del Dios Highway yet. Still, it was a twisty road at varying heights above the river to its right. I'd borrowed my dad's car. I felt the first major nod off just in time to snap awake. I panicked and thought to myself, Jesus, pull it together. I cracked the windows. I turned the radio up. I drove very slowly, cautious and stupid all at once. It was only the next turn when it happened. It was so sudden. The feeling of being shaken awake, roughly, like a giant had picked up my dad's early 90s Ford Explorer and rattled it to see what was inside. I locked my arms on the steering wheel and tried to turn to the left, what I assumed would get me back towards the road, but the shaking, the bumping, the banging were too intense. Between rows and rows of blue and white buses in the UCSD bus yard, that's where I first met Paul. When I met him, I wasn't sure what my type was, but I was sure it wasn't Paul. He was such a pretty boy. He drove his mom's convertible BMW. He tucked in shirts. He wore light wash jeans with dress shoes. In college. But he seemed to have an interest in me, and that's really all it takes. I suppose that's my type, the type that likes me. The thing about being a UCSD shuttle driver, despite having nearly 100 coworkers and one of the more vibrant party scenes on campus, the actual shift work was isolating, lonely. Little more than calls of "next stop" and "thanks for the ride" mumbled from tired and distracted passengers. Some quick one-handed rock, paper, scissors games to passing buses at stop signs. Maybe this is why we took to riding along, hanging out with a coworker during their shift. We'd stand just behind the yellow line at the front of the bus and keep each other company as we drove around in circles. On a Friday in January, I rode along with Paul, countless tiny loops from the center of campus to East Parking. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the kind of attention he paid me. But I decided to ask him what he was doing that night. "Nothing," he said. "What are you doing?" "Also nothing," I said. There was a brief pause, the kind of pause someone should have used to ask me out. Eventually, I said, "Want to do nothing together?" Our doing nothing ended up being quintessentially date-ish. Dinner downtown at the spaghetti factory, the only place 18 and 19-year-olds knew about. A walk to the harbor and scattered rain showers. holding hands, rushing between shop awnings where we'd ride out a downpour and gaze stupidly into each other's eyes. When Paul and I arrived back to his apartment near campus, we sat in his car and stared at each other. Our conversation had been lacking all night, basic, stifled stuff. Nothing like the way we talked when we were just interested in each other. The hours spent together with one of us operating large machinery in circles. I could have ended the night then, chalked him up as a good and flirty coworker. I could have driven home long before the full day's fatigue kicked in, before the whole relationship kicked in. Instead, I said, "Kiss me." We went inside and made out for hours, proper teenage making out. I ended up in some of his sweatpants, not out of any sort of untoward behavior, but because he thought I'd like to change out of my rain-soaked skirt. But at nearly 2 a.m, sitting in what was still a relatively shallow river in a shattered car, I thought, shit, I need to change back into my skirt before anyone finds me or they'll know about the making out. Other immediate thoughts included, I'm going to lose my job for this. I should roll up the windows. I should turn the volume down. That way no one will know I'd been fighting sleep. The engine was dead, but I still bashed uselessly at the volume button with my finger. I was high on fear. My ankles ached and stung as I climbed out of the car and stepped into the river. The roof of the Explorer was crumpled, almost entirely caved in, except for a less depressed area above the driver's seat. The windows were all broken. These should have been the first signs that I didn't just drive in a tidy straight line, that I had instead flipped the car and tumbled straight down about 30 feet into the river, but I was out of my mind. In the back, my dad's flashlight must have been jostled into position. It was on, the beam jutting out through the broken window and upwards into the drizzly night sky. I grabbed it, not ready to think about serendipity just yet. His red plastic toolbox had been shaken open, tools strewn about the entire car. The longer I stood still, the water almost to my knees, the more things started to hurt. My face, the back of my head, the open wound on my neck. The flashlight started to die, and I slowly realized that the only way out was up. I pulled my battered body up the muddy cliff, slipping and scrambling, but I finally made it to the top where the tire tracks ended, and that's when I knew, unequivocally, that I'd rolled straight down into the quickening stream. And then I waited. It took 5 minutes before I saw the first set of headlights. I waved both arms high, shaking the dying flashlight above my head. The car didn't stop. Another car came and went, then another, and another. Then nothing. 10 minutes, maybe more passed. The flashlight was completely dead. The rain fell, stronger now, and it was so dark. I was cold, scared, and alone. Finally, with my desperation maxed out, headlights appeared. I had so little strength to wave, but as the car passed, it slowed down, pulled over, and backed up. He was a nice man with an expensive car and a phone, and I had no choice but to trust. Get in, it's pouring. As I spilled mud and rain and maybe even blood on his Lexus carpet, I called my dad, worried and fearful of consequence and judgment. But in a 2 a.m. phone call about his daughter in a car accident, he wanted nothing more than to hear my voice. Physically, technically, I walked away from it. Just before sunrise, it took a full road closure and a crane to lift the wrecked car, the storm-filled river completely overflowing the crushed roof of the car by then. It took 24 hours for me to get around to calling Paul, to let him know I'd had a freakish car accident on the way home from our date. I just didn't want to talk to him, despite planning out the conversation in my head for hours. Was it the accident, or was it that reluctant phone call that was bad sign number one? It took a week for the deep bruising around my eyes to blossom from the head injury. I took a few weeks off of work on account of not being able to move very well, on account of looking like I'd been in a car wreck, I told them. But the truth was, I was a bit afraid to drive. Maybe we should put up a sign on the bus door, my boss joked. A disclaimer. My boss and coworkers soon forgot about my accident, but their teasing hit me below the belt in ways I never let on. I always knew I was a shitty driver. I really only survived my years as a bus driver by driving very slowly. Several weeks later, back at work, I was white-knuckling the steering wheel of a 30,000-pound Bluebird bus down Interstate 5 on a longer route than usual, trying not to think of driving off the highway, trying not to think of how easily my wrists could flick to one side, of how powerless I was, of how powerless my passengers were. Paul rode along, but he sat down in the front row. Maybe he was afraid too. I drove 50 miles an hour on the freeway and delivered everyone 5 minutes late. When I emptied my passengers, Paul stood to talk to me. You should have radioed that in so the next bus knows to wait, he said about my tardy arrival. You should have driven faster. You'll just make them think you're scared. The bruises under my eyes from the crash were still there, purple and yellow like sacraments, outward and visible signs of an inward disgrace. I slowly realized that when he talked to me, most of what came out were criticisms. Really, only 2 weeks after that first date, and our relationship already sucked. But Paul and I labored on in our ill-fated relationship. We distracted ourselves from the doom by having sex in the back of the buses at the fueling station on Miramar Road, always when one of us was on the clock. But distractions are just that. And eventually I was riding along on shifts with other boys paying attention to me. They put up a guardrail on that corner of Del Dios Highway, but I will always fear that road. I soon graduated, let my Class B license expire, and finally broke up with Paul 2 years after that ominous first date. And I still think I can just roll down the windows and blast the music to stay awake. Thank you.